Hey, g'day guys, welcome to the Holy Shed, which you don't need to be clever to know is not really in a shed at all. I'll show you where I am, I'll show you what I'm looking at in front of me. Pretty good, eh? Yeah, I'm at the coast in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, where yesterday I led an Enneagram workshop, which was a lot of fun. And then this morning, me and Pat joined in with the walking church here on the Isle of Wight. Don't you love the idea? A walking church, church outdoors. And yeah, we've had a lovely time with a great bunch of people. And now I'm grabbing this little bit of time to have a chat with you. Now, we've been thinking in recent Holy Sheds about how to read the Bible and still be a Christian, right? In other words, how to get past the problems and difficulties that often present themselves to us when we start to look at the Bible, and some would say especially in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, but actually there are plenty of problems in the Christian scriptures, the New Testament as well. But the question we've been thinking about is how to get past these, and maybe how to find different and better ways to read and interpret the Bible. And that's important because Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher that I've been talking about over the past couple of weeks, who's an expert in the world of hermeneutics or interpretation, he says it is by interpreting that we can believe again. In other words, that we can reconnect with a text that otherwise we've found alienating. And I think that is true of the Bible as much as it may be of other texts as well. Of course, the fact is that the Bible isn't a single text. It's 66 different texts, many different kinds of text, different genres of literature. So our approach to reading needs to be according to what the nature of the text that we're reading is. And, that's, the starting point for our reinterpretation. For example, the first 11 chapters of Genesis basically fit the genre of myth. Now, by myth, we don't mean false or untrue. It's not a sort of a deprecating statement. Myth is really an archetypal story which serves as a means of trying to understand or interpret some aspect of the world or of human experience or whatever. That's where the idea of myth comes from. And the stories of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and there are two, by the way, which were written about 500 years apart, these, of course, can't possibly be read as science. They're really more theological myths expressing the faith of the early Hebrew community, because they're living with other texts around them, other literature, a wider culture, and trying to forge and formulate their faith and their beliefs in the context of the wider culture. And Genesis basically does what it says on the tin. The word Genesis means beginning, and this is a book of beginnings. And these 11 chapters really deal with very archetypal issues in terms of the human experience, not in a historical or factual sense, but much more in what we'd now see as really a spiritual, psychological, societal sense. So here's the thing. The scripture didn't occur in a vacuum, obviously. They emerged from and they fitted into a whole flourishing surrounding culture of myths and stories and psalms and poetry in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, in Sumer, in Babylon. And the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis in particular are mostly reworkings of existing stories, of existing myths in the ancient Near East, which are then modified to express the peculiarities of the Hebrew theological and religious kind of perspective on things. So biblical stories like the creation, like the birth of humans, the great flood, the Tower of Babel, all of these have earlier versions in the ancient Near East. There are Mesopotamian stories of the flood, for instance, including a Noah figure, which predates the biblical story of Noah by hundreds of years. And I'm going to get to that in a subsequent shed. I mean, it's all a little bit like taking familiar stories in our culture, like Star Wars or Harry Potter or even EastEnders, and utilizing these stories, reworking them to express something of our faith in the context of our own wider culture. So today I'm going to focus on the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. This is a story which is packed with resonance for our world today, which is why I'm beginning with this. And this story echoes the Sumerian myth of the gods Dumazid and Enkidu. And this story is called the dispute between the shepherd god and the farmer god. And in the Sumerian drama, Utu, the sun god, advises his sister Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility, to marry the shepherd, but instead she fancies the farmer. So it really could be EastEnders, couldn't it? Now in the Bible, the rivals are not gods, they're humans. Cain and his younger brother Abel, who offer to God sacrifices from their twin Neolithic domestications of grain and sheep, right? And as the story goes, God preferred the offering of Abel, the younger, to the offering of his older sibling Cain. Seems pretty damned unfair to me, but actually I think choosing the younger brother over the older is a theme in Genesis, okay? God seems to, it's almost like a subversion of a patriarchal culture in which the firstborn is always the heir. Well, that's one perspective on it anyway, but that's how it is. And the psychology of God is not really what this is talking about. So we could say God isn't really being very fair, but that's not the point of the story. It is a story, it's a myth, it's not fact. And I think really, in my language, the basic sort of purpose of the story, the basic message of the story of Cain and Abel is this: shit happens. It's a fact of life. And it's what we do with the things, the shit that happens, that counts. Genesis uses an existing ancient Near Eastern myth or story to dig into the origin of sin. Okay? And right there is an important point, because this story contains the earliest mention of sin in the Bible. Now that might be a surprise to a lot of people. They think, oh, well, sin starts off in the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Well, actually, sin is not mentioned in that story at all. Sin begins here with Cain and Abel, not in the Garden of Eden. And it's nothing to do with apples or pears or a snake or sex, which of course is the church's everlasting preoccupation. It starts in a conflict between two brothers. This is the original sin. And if you want to use that language, it's about sibling rivalry. Okay, it's what is happening right now in the Middle East. Always has been. Arabs are Semitic people as well as Jews. Jews and Arabs are brothers, siblings with a long history of strife and conflict, but also a history of getting on as well. So Muslims trace their history back to Ishmael and Jews to Isaac, and maybe we'll look at that history on another day. But look, set aside the weirdness of God choosing one sacrifice over the other. As I say, crap happens. It's what follows that matters. Cain and Abel argue. The text doesn't say what about, but they argue. But it is no doubt traced back to this kind of feeling of favoritism that Cain is angry about. In midrash writings in the Jewish tradition, the rabbis have a heyday guessing what it was that the argument really was about. Was it to do with the land, going back to that old farmers and shepherds thing in the Sumerian myth, or a woman? Again, as with Inanna and all of that stuff. Rabbi Harold Kushner writes wonderfully about it being the old sibling rivalry about who the parents love most. And the original sin that affects virtually everyone, he says, is not disobedience, it's not lust, but the belief that there's not enough love. to go around, and therefore someone else is loved more. And that's a theme that runs right through Genesis, because it is a very primal theme. But whatever the row was about, before it happened, God told Cain, whether you offer well or whether you don't, he said, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, and you must master it. So hey, in the earliest portrayal of sin, it isn't seen as some internal and irresistible force, or an existential stain on the soul of every human being, as in the original sin thing. Instead, it's likened by God to an external, feral feline that crouches to attack when you least expect. Furthermore, Cain can and should conquer sin, just like any other wild beast that might be crouching ready to attack him. But anger gets the better of Cain, and so he murders his brother Abel, just as Jews and Arabs are murdering each other today. To me, this is a different and more helpful understanding of sin, not something inherited, passed down, through a biological kind of process. It's not something which is inevitable. We have choices. We can make better choices. Isn't that how we see things in real life? I think that just makes sense, really. Where is your brother? God asks. No idea, Cain replies. Am I my brother's keeper? What have you done? God says. Listen, he says. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain undergoes an evolutionary throwback from farmer to hunter-gatherer, not as a divine punishment, but as a consequence of his human choice, which is why I say stay human, because every day we make choices that confirm and enhance our moral evolution as human beings, or which throw us back on earlier sort of versions into reptilian instincts, which of course we see all the time in the world around us, as indeed we're seeing them right now in the Middle East, as well as other parts of the world. But the story goes on, realizing the consequences of following those primal instincts, violence begetting violence. For the first time, Cain experiences fear. Anyone who meets me will kill me, he says. Not so, God replies. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. Now, I always thought that this meant that God would get them, kill 7 more. But no, that would mean that Cain had trapped God into escalating violence, and I, for one, can't believe in a violent God. But notice what happens next. It says Cain knew, in the biblical sense, his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And Cain built a city, which he called Enoch. And this is the first biblical mention of the dawn of civilization. Cain built the first city. He built a city with walls. Why? As a form of protection, as a consequence of violence, and that violence will reproduce violence. So he wanted a place to belong, a place of safety for his family. And it's here in the new world of civilization that Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, boasts to his 2 wives that he'd killed a man for wounding him, a young man for striking him. And that's sort of another significant sort of first mention, really. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, the man brags, truly for Lamech it will be 77-fold. I'll multiply the revenge. It's an old story, isn't it? It's an archetypal myth, but it's true as we see it right through in our world today, that once violence is introduced, once brutality is introduced into the world, into a relationship, into a situation, it tends to reproduce itself and multiply. The story of Cain and Abel isn't just about an original fratricide, it's about escalatory violence, almost as a seductive inevitability. But it presents a God who avows that it is not an inevitability, that this pattern could be overcome. The original sin in the Bible is violence, and more than that, escalatory violence. And cities, civilizations, is where that escalation mostly occurs. But it's not inevitable. You must overcome it, God says to Cain. The choice is yours, and it's still ours today. It's still our choice. You send missiles on us and we'll send them back. But it's not inevitable. That's a choice to do that. Other choices are on offer. John Dominic Crossan points out that we humans are not natural born killers. If we were, we would suffer from post-traumatic stress after battle. He says, the mark of Cain is on human civilization, not on human nature. Escalatory violence is our nemesis, not our inevitability, our avoidable decision, not our unescapable destiny. It's our original sin, but we can do something about it. Stay human. Does Jesus have this story in mind? I wonder, when he says, forgive your brother 70 times 7. Forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation are always available, and they are the way out. In his classic book, The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell says, a myth is something that has never happened, but is happening all the time. Which is why the rabbis have engaged in midrash, interpreting and pondering these stories, searching these strange ancient texts. They explored what makes people so angry that they lose control and are driven to destroy what they love the most, and in the process destroy themselves. And I wish that there were more rabbis around thinking like that today. Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, a lovely name, she writes beautiful Bible storybooks for children. Each one is an exercise in modern midrash or interpretation. And if I can see what I'm doing here, Cain and Abel, this is a book, Cain and Abel, Finding the Fruits of Peace. And this is a great rewriting of the story for children, but it works for adults too. And she envisages brothers who loved each other, but one day argued about whether it was better to be a farmer or a shepherd. Cain insisted that God loved the farmer the best. After all, God planted the first garden, he declared. Abel argued that God loved the shepherd best. After all, God created the animals and watches over them, he insisted. Cain and Abel prayed to God, and when Cain prayed, he brought with him a large basket of ripened vegetables. When Abel prayed, he brought the finest sheep. Cain looked at his silent vegetables shriveled up in the noon sun, while Abel's sheep bleated happily in the field. Cain was certain that God must like sheep better than vegetables. Maybe God did indeed like the shepherd better than the farmer, she writes. Now, Sandy Sasso's children's midrash internalizes the story. Divine rejection is something in Cain's head. It's a story that never happened, but happens all the time. Internal fears and anxieties are projected onto the outside world, resulting in anger and bullying, or paranoia and nervous breakdown, in conflict and war, or fearful withdrawal and depression. Unresolved anger has consequences, but there's a different way, the story seems to say. And looking at our world just now, I really do hope so. Rabbi Jesus took a similar approach in the Sermon on the Mount, internalizing the issue. It's not just the act of murder, he says, it's the anger that you feel first that you need to deal with. That's where sin crouches at the door. That's where you need to deal with it. To me, the myth of Cain and Abel is a story of innocence lost through pointless conflict and jealousy, and a mistaken sense of rejection, escalating to anger and violence, to conflict and war. As Sandy Sasso tells the story, she says this: time passed, a long time. The world was not new anymore. People built cities and made homes there, yet people often spoke angry words, and with angry words they drew their swords. Swords turned to guns, and guns to bombs. One killing became two, two became four, and four became 16. 16 killings became a full-blown war. Entire worlds were destroyed. Perhaps one day, she writes, when each person learns to reach out an open hand without the rock, without the sword, without the gun, the entire world can be saved. Now, I'll tell you what, guys, that's the kind of Sunday school story I want our kids and grandkids to hear. From all this, I take 4 conclusions about original sin. First, according to the unequivocal text of the Bible, sin originally occurred not in the paradise of Genesis 2 and 3, but in the human field of Genesis 4. Second, sin in Genesis 4 is not a flaw in creation, but in civilization. A fault not in nature, but in culture. Third, original sin is not about individuals and sex, but about communities and violence. It's about humanity's proclivity for escalatory violence as a drug of choice, especially of people drunk on power. And fourth, sin is not inescapable or irresistible. You must rule over it, says God. Make different choices. Be kind. Learn to forgive and climb down. Be reconciled. Talk things through instead of leaping to defend yourself and then seeking vengeance. And so I just want to say, why don't you buy or download Sandy Eisenberg's beautiful little book, Cain and Abel, Finding the Fruits of Peace. I mean, get it for your kids, get it for your grandkids, read it with them, and talk about it with them afterwards, because we have to break the cycle of violence in all its forms wherever we can, starting with our young people. I mean, where such awful, devastating things seem to be happening so often. It's devastating that the so-called rape culture is so prevalent in our schools, that so many kids carry knives. We need to find ways to intervene on this, and I think that this story of Cain and Abel offers a little bit of wisdom that can help. We've got to talk about these things with our children, with our young people, and show them by our example how to be human, how to stay human in an often dehumanizing world, how to de-escalate violence and brutality, how to find a way of peace and reconciliation, how to wind the temperature down, as it were, how to climb down. So here's a prayer for a different kind of world. Sometimes, dear God, this feels like a very scary, out-of-control world, ruled by silly, incompetent, or dangerous people. Well, that's how I see it. Meanwhile, undeserving fat cats prosper while the vulnerable and disadvantaged suffer, just because they are vulnerable and disadvantaged, while millions of others feel powerless to intervene. And then all these conflicts, any of which could spark a geopolitical conflagration, while leaders appear to trust drones, missiles, and bloodshed more than the ancient solemn art of negotiation, empathizing, conceding, compromising, turning enemies into friends, or at least collaborators. I sometimes wish you were that God that many claim you are, the superhero in the sky who at will could swoop in, fix Earth's troubles, beat up the bad guys, usher in utopia. Hey presto. But even if you could, that is not your way. Vengeance, so-called redemptive violence, defeating power with even greater power, that is too much like the world we long to see the back of. Save us, we pray, from leaders with small minds and mean spirits. Strengthen the hands of those of whatever political persuasion who imagine a different, better way to resolve Earth's problems. Fill us all with passion for kindness and justice, and empower us to hope against hope, to lean daily into another future. Divine love made incarnate. Amen. Now, sitting here where I am right now, I don't even have a drink to propose a toast with. But if I did, and you may have one, I propose a toast to the creative spirit of friendship to being able to disagree passionately but in a friendly way, to honest argument and heartfelt agreement, a toast to those who are living in war zones and long for peace. I'd like to toast studying war no more, laying down our defences and learning to embrace even those who we disagree with. So hey, to life, l'chaim. So there you go, guys. If you like what I'm doing here in the shed, you can support us. You can buy us a coffee. You just need to follow the link on your screen, and we're deeply grateful to all those of you who support us like this and in lots of other ways too. So just let me finish by flagging up again the things I'm going to be doing during October. I've added another date actually, which is in Billingham. You can see that on there, on Teesside, where we used to live for 9 years. And looking forward to this. It's going to be a busy October, but I can't wait. So there it is. That's about it for now. I'll tell you what, I'm just going to put up a blessing, which I think is here somewhere. Let me just say the words and then I'll let the music go. The blessing of God, the eternal goodwill of God, the shalom and salam of God, the wildness and warmth of God, be among us and between us, now and always. Amen. Thanks for being with me. I've actually got to rush now to catch the ferry, so I won't play the music. But thanks for being with me, and join me again when we'll pick up on the themes we've been talking about and take it further. Meanwhile, if you've got any thoughts or ideas or any comments or questions about what I'm saying, I'd love to hear from you. Okie dokie, take care, stay human, see you soon.